an opinion article brought up by Peter Greste. If you're not aware of who he was a journalist at the time. At least that was his main reason for being there. He was jailed in Egypt for a period. And, well, you talk about press freedoms and everything else. Well, it's a pretty clear example of not having a free press. But what Peter Greste is talking about here in this article is that he suffered in Egypt, but he sees Australia's path towards surveillance and, I guess, big brotherism not in a very positive light. Okay, yeah, people want to feel safe, etc., but the problem is it gave political space to pass an extraordinary suite of laws that create a culture of surveillance and secrecy at all levels. It's the issue that the Patriot Act in the US encountered. Immediately post September 11, 2001, there was a national urge for vengeance and a desire to throw away liberties in order to secure power that could be then used to bring terrorists and bad people to heel. The problem is, as people have long said over times, and this isn't just necessarily the Patriot Act, is that it's one thing to take power. It's another thing altogether to give it up willingly. And so when you consolidate power like they have in the Patriot Act, you're fighting an uphill battle with Congress and governments and presidencies and administrations to, well, dismiss the Patriot Act, wind back the powers captured within it. Similar sort of things happen here in Australia. I mean, post September 11, I mean, we also had the MV Tampa affair, which led into a big change or a bigger shift in handling of potentially illegal migration. And we're still feeling the effects to that now. And it's also, I guess, the idea that if you're going to give yourself powers to use against a section of the population, or you've got to consider what's going to happen when the political pendulum swings back in the other direction, and as to whether those powers will be used against you, and whether you're comfortable with that. If you're comfortable with that, then fine, go ahead, secure the powers and use them. But the idea that, yeah, we're introducing or taking these extra powers. And, yep, so he says that he's been exposed to, well, worked around some horrible authoritarian ones. But he says that Australia seems to be far more secretive and, well, not as much of an open liberal democracy as, well, they claim to be. That is a reasonable complaint. I don't think it's necessarily without foundation. It's also one that we potentially, out of COVID, I guess, was a big part of it too. There was, as we saw in that immediately previous article, a desire to cast aside civil liberties because they could. And yeah, well, here we go. Post September 11, we talked about it. A whole bunch of changes. The idea that because we have more separate national security laws, it's a problem. I'd actually prefer that. The alternative is you have some sort of omnibus bill. Now, if the choice was between, say, 100 different national security laws in Australia the way it is now, or one mega bill, one mega act, like, say, perhaps the Patriot Act. I'd rather the separate ones, because by having them separate, you allow each one to be challenged individually. And so you can take them to court and get them overturned or refined on an individual level. Whereas if it was an omnibus, you'd struggle to separate it out from the overarching legislation. At least if it's a separate bill on its own thing, it gives more transparency. I mean, not that anyone reads the legislation anyway, but it forces debate and decisions on more discrete levels rather than everything under the sun. Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know, like I said, I don't think that's a criticism, a valid criticism, I guess. And yeah, I mean, this is a criticism that's leveled against, I guess, other nations as well, with their systems as well, that these policies and rules that most people think of as like wartime powers, they've now become permanent, because once that power's been grabbed, it's not going to be given up. It's like certain taxation rules in various countries around the world that were meant to be short-term or interim taxation measures are permanent. What government is going to give up revenue? So, data retention. So there's issues now. Obviously, he's got his issues with all of it. He sees this data retention legislation as terrifying. I think anybody who was or is privacy paranoid was probably expecting this to have been done for years beforehand, if not by Australia, of Australian citizens, certainly by other foreign intelligence services, or even foreign technical companies having the ability to reach in and look at some of this sort of data, or anytime Australian data transited through foreign networks, it gave people the opportunity to look at it or to capture data on it. Now, some of this is a fundamental misunderstanding of how technical networks and data exchange takes place. There's plenty of it, this metadata, that is essential to routing of information through the internet and various other networks as well. So the idea that the metadata is captured, to be honest, is not that much of an issue. I mean, I suppose it depends on what they use it for. But the idea that it wasn't previously being captured or wasn't previously being used, yeah, I think it is a little bit off target with that one. Now, if it wasn't just the metadata, if it was the actual data being captured and stored, okay, you've got more of a problem. But anything that transits through US networks in previous years would have been captured in total. Just trying to think what the name of the rooms were. I mean, in the big, I'd have to look it up. I don't want to get it wrong. Yeah, the various intelligence services basically made a copy of every bit of information passing through various commercial US networks. Now, far beyond metadata, if your data, by virtue of an efficient routing path, ended up going through that network, it was captured too. And it's the complaint here is that your metadata, whilst it's not specific data about what is going on, it allows enough to build up a pattern of life, or a pattern of activities of an individual. Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit easier if it's an electronic footprint, but I mean, the same sort of information could have been gathered in the past. It just required a lot more hands-on effort. Yeah. Now, again, the government's taken power for itself, and then the question is, how does it use the legislation? And this is a fair point. I mean, 350,000 requests for metadata? Is that appropriate? I don't know. I don't think so. And it certainly does seem like a bit of an overreach, as it says here, like a local council using it to try and find out the identity of a dog, or the owner of a dog who left a mess behind. Yeah, okay, that's a bit of an overreach. But again, that sort of information potentially could have been gathered beforehand. And that's not so much a failure of the legislation. It's, well, I suppose if the legislation gives permission for anybody to access it, it's a failure of the systems in place to limit the access to that information. And, well, it talks about accountability, and I mean, as this guy's a journalist and has spent time in prison because of his journalistic work, yeah, protecting sources. Yeah, okay, fair enough. You could be concerned that the government, and I mean, it's not beyond that concept. I mean, exposing whistleblowers. There's plenty of reasons why people want to keep identities, if not secret, off the record. Yeah, I can see his point here that it's very hard to maintain off the record or protected information. Even wasn't necessarily metadata, but it was national security stuff when it was exposed that Australia had been gathering intelligence on East Timor and that it had influenced the outcome of oil and gas lease negotiation off the Northwest Shelf. No, not the Northwest Shelf, sorry, off between Australia and Timor. When that got exposed, it's like, well, there was the national security elements of it. But a lot of the information that had been gathered and how it had been gathered and everything else would have been the same if it was all completely physical rather than electronic. Yeah. Sources are drying up. Well, see, the idea that it's he's blaming this sort of legislation as a reason why people are less likely to come forward. Newsrooms are cancelling investigations. I'd also put that down to a change in the nature of media. And the major media organisations are no longer as well funded as they once were, so they can't afford to take the time to do these deeper level investigations that they once did. And people finding that they can hop on social media and have their own voice and get the reach, and information flows out that way now instead. And so these major media organisations are being sidelined to a degree. But yes, governments are definitely becoming less transparent. I mean, the whole idea of freedom of information requests. I know there's a left-leaning site that is basically doing a whole bunch of freedom of information requests. I haven't looked into what they're doing, but whilst their ideology might be a bit more extreme, the idea of what they're pursuing is wonderful and is fantastic. That there needs to be that this bubble of silence, this bubble of secrecy that is surrounding stuff that shouldn't be secret, or that should be made aware to the public. The idea that these freedom of information requests are taking years to be responded to, and so they're fighting the good fight by constantly lodging freedom of information requests to get information. Now, if you've ever been on the receiving end of one of these requests, they're not fun. They're not fun to comply with, particularly if they've come down from on high, because then you're pressured by senior leadership as well as the obligations to meet whatever's required for it. Yeah. But the idea that you can, an expansion of the scope of information the government can refuse to release on a public interest test, ooh, that's not so good. That's not so good. Now, cabinet in confidence has always been a thing. I don't know necessarily that. I mean, I get why he says this, but I don't necessarily agree that that's the case. But yes, no, look, less transparency in government is always a bad thing. But yeah, it's. I do like the idea that there needs to be a bit more pushback on it. Certainly. I mean, I certainly agree with his viewpoints in that regard.